Every country faces illegal migrant problems when people from other countries illegally cross borders and live in another country. For Europe, this is a crisis, as hundreds of thousands of people from Africa try to enter Europe every year. Since they cannot afford to legally immigrate to Europe, they sadly have to use illegal means. For this, Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya become the hotbeds. They are the countries located just at the top of the African continent, being only 600 kilometers from Italy and other European countries. Among them, Tunisia is nearest to Europe, having the Mediterranean Sea in between. To solve this problem, which is a crisis in itself, the EU offers a few $1 million to ensure patrolling security. This is done so Europe does not face a migrant crisis. That's when Tunisia's president asks why he should be the only one caring for Europe's security. By accepting a few $1 million, why should he protect Europe? Well, now he has rejected the immigrant deals, unleashing a major crisis for Europe. If he ends cooperation, Europe will have to spend tens of billions of dollars to solve this issue. What more did the Tunisian president say, and how can he flood Europe with immigrants? Let's find out and know how he is the man controlling Europe's security. Recently, Tunisian President Kais Saied rejected financial support announced by the European Union in September. He deemed the amount insufficient and in conflict with the deal signed just 3 months ago, potentially jeopardizing a strategic partnership formed in July. This partnership included measures to combat human trafficking and strengthen border security, particularly during a surge in boats departing from North Africa for Europe. The European Commission had recently pledged to provide €127 million in aid to Tunisia as part of the agreement to combat illegal immigration from Africa to Europe. President Saied, however, expressed his rejection, not solely because of the modest amount, but due to its inconsistency with the Memorandum of Understanding signed in July. The July agreement included a commitment of €1 billion in aid to Tunisia to support its struggling economy, address state finances, and manage the migration crisis. The smaller sum announced by Europe has been a source of frustration for Tunisian authorities, who are working to stabilize public finances. It has also raised concerns among credit rating agencies regarding the potential for the government to default on foreign debts in the coming months. This dispute has coincided with a surge in the arrival of migrants from Tunisia and North Africa to Italy's Lampedusa island. Recently, Tunisia postponed a visit by a European Commission delegation to discuss the details of the migration agreement. In addition, the country denied entry to 5 members of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee last month, citing non-interference in its internal affairs. Some European countries, including Germany, have opposed the immigration deal, arguing that it does not adequately address human rights concerns and the political situation. The funds the EU has pledged to offer to Tunisia are being called aid. In reality, it is the cost Europe has to pay to solve the immigration crisis. It's not an aid in any sense. President Saied's statement, calling these funds a charity, highlights Tunisia's commitment to cooperation, but not to what it perceives as charity or handouts, prioritizing its sovereignty and the respect it expects in international agreements. Tunisia's recent rejection of European Union funds raises doubts about a comprehensive agreement brokered in Rome in July between the EU and Tunisian President Kais Saied. This agreement promised over €1 billion in aid to Tunisia, which was never paid. Hence, Tunisia's president rejected the very deal because the EU cannot expect Tunisia to solve the immigration problem without paying the funds. However, Marcus Cornaro, the EU's ambassador to Tunisia, downplayed concerns about the agreement's viability. He suggested that Saied's remarks signaled a shared eagerness to implement the agreement rather than a confrontation. According to Cornaro, both sides were keen to expedite the process, emphasizing that the agreement was on track and not mired in misunderstanding. The July agreement included a commitment of €105 million designated for migration-related initiatives. It's because Tunisia has become a primary departure point for migrants and refugees seeking to reach Europe, with over 90,000 people crossing the Mediterranean from Tunisia to Italy this year. Many of them use frail boats to reach Lampedusa, an island closer to North Africa than Italy. In response to the rising number of arrivals, the European Commission announced an initial disbursement of €127 million to Tunisia, with more than half allocated for migration-related efforts such as combating smuggling, supporting Tunisian law enforcement, and facilitating the return of migrants to their countries of origin. However, Most of the funds are tied to Tunisia reaching an agreement with the International Monetary Fund on stalled loan negotiations. In other words, Tunisia will be paid the funds to end the immigration problem for Europe only if it reaches a deal with the IMF. In turn, the IMF wants Tunisia to put extra taxes on food and essentials, which the president also rejected. He cannot afford to do what he is told to, even if it leads to ending agreements. Sayed has been hesitant to accept the IMF's conditions, which may involve painful cuts to food and energy subsidies. Additionally, Sayed has resisted proposals to allow sub-Saharan African migrants expelled from Europe to resettle in Tunisia, despite past frameworks permitting European nations to send asylum seekers to safe third countries to avoid returning them to perilous situations. You see, Europe wants Tunisia to be responsible for every matter and crisis it is facing when it comes to immigrants. Tunisia is supposed to stop these immigrants, and if they reach Europe, it is supposed to house them as well. Tunisia's president thought that perhaps it was better to reject a few $1,000,000 than to undertake an operation which demanded billions of dollars and helped only Europe. The rejection of the EU funds occurred shortly after Tunisia barred entry to European Parliament delegates seeking to visit the country, citing a refusal to allow interference in its internal politics. Tunisian President Kais Saied has declared his rejection of the funds allocated by the European Union to Tunisia. He characterized the EU's financial offer as a form of charity and deemed the amount insufficient, contrary to the agreement made in July. The European Commission announced the allocation of funds on September 22nd as part of the agreement with Tunisia to reduce the influx of migrants from the country. Of the €105 million dedicated to combat irregular immigration, around €42 million was set to be swiftly distributed, in addition to €24.7 million designated for ongoing cooperation programs. Sayed expressed his refusal of the EU's offer, stating that Tunisia values cooperation but does not accept what resembles charity, particularly if it lacks respect. He stressed that the rejection was not primarily due to the modest amount, but rather because the proposal contradicted the agreement signed in Tunis and the spirit of the conference in Rome held in July. Sayed further affirmed that Tunisia is making every effort to dismantle criminal human trafficking networks. Tunisia is trying to help the EU. However, the latter wants to exploit even this. Amnesty International's report sheds light on how the European Union is making an old mistake in Tunisia. While EU representatives were busy signing a memorandum of understanding with President Kais Saied in July to curb migration to Europe, hundreds of refugees and migrants were abandoned in the Tunisian desert bordering Libya without access to essential resources. This situation, which resulted in numerous deaths, has been downplayed by European leaders. One glaring issue is the ongoing practice of Tunisian authorities, forcibly pushing migrants to the Libyan border, as Europe wants, where many are left in dire need of humanitarian aid. Shockingly, EU leaders have not publicly condemned these actions. Instead, the European Commission is actively cooperating with Tunisian authorities to prevent refugees and migrants from reaching Europe, perpetuating a cycle of abuse and hostility in Tunisia. The agreement was signed without human rights conditions, impact assessments, or mechanisms to suspend cooperation in the event of abuse. This situation mirrors the EU's controversial cooperation with Libya, which led to complicity in human rights violations against migrants and refugees, including torture and arbitrary detention. Such agreements don't save lives or deter migration, but push people to take more dangerous routes while benefiting smugglers. Moreover, they do not address the root causes of migration, people seeking safety and security. It is disheartening that the EU is doubling down on the Tunisia deal. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To understand how grave of an issue the migration crisis is, you have to know its history. Since the 1960s, the primary source countries for African migration to Europe have included Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and to a lesser extent, Egypt. This led to the establishment of significant diasporas from these nations by the late 20th century. In the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis, European countries tightened immigration controls, which didn't reduce North African migration, but instead encouraged the permanent settlement of previously temporary migrants and their families. A considerable portion of this migration was from the Maghreb to countries like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. From the latter half of the 1980s, the destination countries for migrants from the Maghreb expanded to include Spain and Italy, due to increased demand for low-skilled labor in those nations. Spain and Italy implemented visa requirements for Maghreb migrants in the early 1990s, leading to an upsurge in illegal migration across the Mediterranean. Subsequently, since 2000, the source countries for this illegal migration have extended to include sub-Saharan African states. Between 2000 and 2005, an estimated 440,000 individuals emigrated from Africa annually, with most heading to Europe. The public often characterizes African migration to Europe as an exodus, composed mainly of illegal migrants fleeing conflict and poverty. However, this portrayal is critiqued by migration experts who argue that many illegal migrants are well-educated and can afford the journey. They contend that migration from Africa to Europe is driven by a demand for cheap labor in informal sectors, and most migrants initiate the journey themselves rather than being victims of traffickers. Contrary to the perception of most irregular African migrants arriving by sea, many enter Europe legally with tourist visas or false documentation, and subsequently overstay their visas. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, migration from African countries to more developed nations is relatively small compared to overall global migration. Nevertheless, there is a discrepancy in estimates of the number of African migrants in Europe, with figures ranging from 4.6 million to 8 million illegal migrants from Africa residing in the EU. Undocumented migration from Africa to Europe is substantial, with many people from less developed African countries setting on dangerous journeys in hopes of a better life. Trafficking immigrants to Europe has become more lucrative in parts of North Africa than drug trafficking. This undocumented migration often occurs via the Mediterranean Sea, posing significant risks to migrants, many of whom die or suffer serious injuries. Those whose asylum requests are denied often face deportation. In this respect, Libya has emerged as a major departure point for illegal migrants bound for Europe. It's important to note that some undocumented African migrants in Europe entered legally but have overstayed their visas due to increased exclusion by European migration policies. They are left with little choice but to live illegally. In 2013 to 2014, the Italian government launched Operation Mare Nostrum to combat unauthorized migration and reduce shipwrecks off the coast of Lampedusa. This operation was deemed unsustainable and replaced by Operation Triton, managed by the EU border agency, Frontex, which some European governments argued might serve as an unintended pull factor for further migration. In 2014, Italy recorded 170,100 illegal migrant arrivals by sea, a substantial increase from 42,925 in 2013. These migrants mostly came from Syria, the Horn of Africa, and West Africa. The issue gained international attention with the 2015 Mediterranean migration crisis, leading to migrant shipwrecks and high casualties. Critics argued that the cancellation of Operation Mare Nostrum and its replacement with Triton contributed to the increased death toll. In September 2023, Lampedusa witnessed over 120 boats carrying approximately 7,000 migrants from Africa, arriving within 24 hours, surpassing the island's total population. This proves that the immigration crisis is far more serious than any other on which EU and African countries have to collaborate honestly. However, the European Union lacks a unified immigration policy regarding third-country nationals. Some countries, such as Spain and Malta, have urged other EU member states to share the responsibility of managing migration flows from Africa. Spain has also established legal migration pathways for African migrants, recruiting workers from countries including Senegal. In contrast, states like France, during Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency, have adopted more restrictive policies and attempted to provide incentives for migrants to return to Africa. Another argument here can be that the EU could strike a deal with African countries where illegal immigrants are coming from. This deal could set a comprehensive plan to provide job opportunities for Africans in Europe, who are longing to risk their lives for a better life. However, instead of doing this, the EU just wants to shut its doors and offer some charity to handle the immigration crisis. The EU has to understand that this is a humanitarian crisis, where people are choosing illegal routes for a chance at a better life. Hundreds of thousands of these immigrants have their stories to tell. We are dying here. We need a safe place. We don't care if that place is in Africa or anywhere else. We want to go, voiced a South Sudanese refugee. Tunisia is estimated to be home to around 21,000 sub-Saharan individuals, including migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. Some have already returned to their countries through voluntary repatriation. Nonetheless, experts argue that the situation in Tunisia is contributing to the increase in tragic incidents in the Mediterranean Sea, which has shocked all of Europe. There's a significant difference when you compare today's living conditions to 2 or 3 years ago, says Bachir, a father of 2 who is diligently saving with the hope of being able to leave the country. I earned less, but was able to save more. Nowadays, you can't save anything. You work just to eat and survive. Experts argue that the EU is actually migrating from Tunisia, not stopping it. Not only that, but the EU is showing itself to be ever more desperate to strike a senseless deal with Tunisia to reduce migration with very little regard for human life. Recently, the EU vowed to offer Tunisia more than €1 billion to stabilize the country's economy and reduce Mediterranean migration. However, this was not paid, and Sayed emphasized that Tunisia doesn't want to become Europe's border guard. For years, Tunisia has been receiving millions of euros from the EU to manage migration. However, this cannot be done unless it receives significant funds to make a clear migration policy or adopt laws on asylum and refugees. Even after paying millions and doing enough publicity that the EU is paying billions to Tunisia, nothing has been done in reality. The problem stays where it was before. As per the European Border Agency, Frontex, the Central Mediterranean route has emerged as the most frequently used path by refugees to reach the EU this year, with 66,000 detections reported by national authorities in the first 6 months of 2023. It was reported that this route accounted for 1 of every 2 entries into the EU this year. The Central Mediterranean route links North African countries, including Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, and Libya, to Italy and Malta. Tragically, over the first 3 months of the year, more than 400 refugees lost their lives in the Central Mediterranean, marking the deadliest quarter of the world's most perilous refugee crossing since 2017, according to the United Nations. In recent months, thousands of African refugees have flocked to the city of Sfax in Tunisia. The notorious deal was struck between the EU and Tunisia, but rights organizations and Mediterranean rescue missions have strongly criticized the deal, labeling it dangerous, and have raised concerns about how it will safeguard the vulnerable. Eve Getty, Amnesty International's advocacy director in Europe, expressed her disapproval, stating that this decision indicates that no lessons have been learned from similar agreements. This ill-advised agreement, signed despite mounting evidence of serious human rights abuses by authorities, will result in a dangerous expansion of already failed migration policies, she stated in response to the signing. What do you think? Should Tunisia help Europe solve the immigrant crisis by taking charity? Or should they be paid enough for proper security as they have to if they were to solve the problem themselves? Let us know your thoughts on the Tunisia president's bold move of rejecting what he called charity. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.